The gavel's sharp crack echoed through courtroom 5 as Judge Brooks demanded, "Sergeant Keene, you will stand for this court." No one expected what followed, a moment that would shake the foundations of justice itself and remind an entire nation what it means to truly stand for something. Courtroom 5 of the Riverside County Courthouse was a study in faded grandeur. Once gleaming oak panels had dulled with age, and the American flag beside the judge's bench hung limp and dusty in the stale air. The harsh fluorescent lighting cast unflattering shadows across the faces of those present, highlighting worry lines and tired eyes. The room smelled of lemon-scented cleaner, barely masking decades of anxiety and desperations. In the defendant's chair sat Sergeant David Keene, 34. His weathered face a map of experiences most civilians couldn't comprehend. His right leg, or what remained of it, was carefully concealed beneath his pressed khaki pants, while his left hand occasionally trembled. An invisible reminder of the IED that had changed his life forever during his third tour in Iraq. His wheelchair, a Militara model that had become an extension of himself, was positioned awkwardly beside the defense table as if the courtroom itself hadn't been designed with someone like him in mind. Before the war, David had been a high school physics teacher in this very county. Known for staying late to help struggling students and coaching the wrestling team to their first state championship, his students had cheered the loudest when he'd enlisted after 9/11. Driven by a sense of duty that had been instilled in him by his father, a Vietnam veteran. The photograph of his classroom sending him off 30 teenagers with handmade signs still sat on his nightstand, though most of those students had graduated college by now. Despite losing his leg and suffering traumatic brain injury, David possessed a remarkable resilience. He never complained about his condition, instead channeling his energy into helping fellow veterans navigate the labyrinthine VA system. His small apartment had become an unofficial headquarters for veterans seeking assistance with paperwork appeals. And sometimes just a sympathetic ear from someone who truly understood the irony of today's hearing wasn't lost on anyone familiar with David's case. He faced contempt charges for missing 3 court appearances related to a minor traffic violation. A violation that occurred when he had to swerve his hand-controlled vehicle to avoid a texting driver. The court had repeatedly scheduled hearings at the downtown courthouse, which was notoriously inaccessible by public transportation for someone with David's mobility challenges. His requests for accommodation or rescheduling had been systematically denied by the court clerk, who cited procedural regulations with bureaucratic indifference. Presiding over the case was Judge Elena Brooks, whose reputation for strict adherence to courtroom protocol preceded her. At 58, she had spent 2 decades on the bench building a reputation as a law and order judge who showed little patience for excuses. Her own father had been a career military officer, though she rarely spoke of him or her upbringing on the various military bases where she'd grown up. Some courthouse veterans whispered that this was precisely why she seemed particularly harsh with military defendants, as if determined to prove she showed no favoritism. As the bailiff called the court to order, the tension in the room was palpable. This wasn't just about a missed court date anymore. For everyone watching, it had become something far more significant. A test of how the system treated those who had sacrificed everything for it. Case number 23, CR 7842, State v. David Keene. In the matter of contempt of court, the clerk announced, her voice echoing in the now silent courtroom. Judge Brooks peered over her reading glasses, scanning the file before her with pursed lips. "Mr. Keene, this is the 4th time this matter has come before this court. You have repeatedly failed to appear as ordered." David's court-appointed attorney Marcus Washington, a young lawyer, just 3 years out of law school, rose quickly. "Your Honor, as we've documented in our filings, Sergeant Keene's absence was due to—" "I can speak for myself," David interrupted gently, placing a steadying hand on Marcus's arm. The young attorney looked uncertain but nodded and sat down. "Your Honor?" David began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being. "I've submitted documentation explaining that the bus route to this courthouse was changed last year. The nearest stop is now 8 blocks away with no accessible path for a wheelchair. I requested either a teleconference appearance or a transfer to the West Side Courthouse, which has—" Judge Brooks cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Mr. Pluser, Keene court procedures are not a lot options from which you can select at your convenience. The law applies equally to everyone." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. In the gallery, an elderly man in a Korean War veteran's cap shook his head in visible disapproval. "With all due respect, Your Honor," David continued, "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for equal access to justice, the Americans with Disabilities Act." "Mr. Keene," Judge Brooks interrupted again, her voice taking on an edge. "This court is well aware of federal statutes. What this court will not tolerate is being lectured on the law by a defendant." She shuffled the papers before her. "The record shows you received proper notice for each hearing. Your failure to appear constitutes contempt regardless of your excuses." Marcus Washington stood again. "Your Honor, my client is a decorated combat veteran who sustained his injuries in service to this country. Surely the court can show some flexibility." In Mr. Point.as. Washington, Judge Brooks said sharply, "Your client's military service, while commendable, does not place him above the law. In fact, as someone who took an oath to defend this country, he should understand better than most the importance of respecting legal authority." The courtroom fell silent. David's face remained impassive, though those closest to him could see the muscle tightening in his jaw. Judge Brooks straightened her robe and looked directly at David. "Before I pronounce sentence in this matter, the defendant will rise and face this court." Marcus immediately began to protest. "Your Honor, my client is physically unable to." "The defendant will stand." Judge Brooks repeated, her voice like steel. "This is my courtroom, Mr. Washington. And in my courtroom, defendants show proper respect by standing to receive their sentence." David looked up at the judge, meeting her gaze directly. "Your Honor, I would stand if I could. I have a prosthetic leg, but due to nerve damage, I can only use it for limited periods. Today is not a good day." Something flickered across Judge Brooks' face, irritation perhaps, or disbelief. "Mr. Keene, I see no medical personnel in this courtroom telling me you cannot stand. What I do see is a defendant attempting to garner sympathy through his condition. This court will not be manipulated. You will stand or you will be held in contempt again." A shocked silence fell over the courtroom. Even the court reporter paused, her fingers hovering above her stenotype machine. David looked at Marcus, who appeared utterly helpless, then back at the judge. With a resigned nod, he gripped the arms of his wheelchair and began the laborious process of standing. David's face contorted with effort as he pushed himself upward, his good leg trembling under the sudden weight. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the defense table for support. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the courtroom's chill. For a moment, a brief, hopeful moment, he was upright, swaying slightly, but standing. A flicker of triumph crossed his face as he faced Judge Brooks with as much dignity as he could muster. Then came the tremor. Anyone familiar with nerve damage would have recognized the warning sign, the slight spasm that ran through his body, starting at his damaged leg and traveling upward. David's face registered alarm, then resignation as he felt his balance failing. "I can't," he began, but it was too late. David collapsed, his prosthetic leg buckling beneath him. He fell hard, his shoulder striking the edge of the defense table before he hit the floor. A collective gasp rose from the spectators as Marcus rushed to help him. "Your Honor, please," Marcus pleaded, kneeling beside his client. But it wasn't the young attorney's words that captured the courtroom's attention, it was David himself. Despite the pain evident on his face, despite the humiliation of lying on the cold courtroom floor, the veteran was trying once again to stand. "Stay down, David," Marcus urged quietly. "Don't do this to yourself. Help me up," David insisted through gritted teeth. "If the court wants me to stand, I'll stand." In the gallery, the elderly Korean War veteran suddenly rose to his feet. "I'll stand for him," he announced, his voice cracking with emotion. Beside him, a middle-aged woman in a postal worker's uniform stood as well. "My son served with men like him. I'll stand too." One by one, people throughout the courtroom began to rise, first a handful, then a dozen, then everyone present. The court clerk, the bailiff, after a moment's hesitation, a young reporter, who had been half asleep in the back row, even the stenographer set aside her machine and stood. Only Judge Brooks remained seated, her expression transitioning from anger to confusion as she witnessed the silent rebellion unfolding in her courtroom. "Order," she demanded, though her voice lacked its usual authority. "I will have order in this court." From his position on the floor, David looked up at the standing crowd, momentary confusion, giving way to profound gratitude. With Marcus's help, he managed to pull himself back into his wheelchair. "Your Honor," he said quietly once seated again. "It appears I'm standing now through them." Judge Brooks stared at the room full of standing citizens, some in tears, others with expressions of quiet defiance, and for the first time in her judicial career, she seemed at a loss for words. The silence was broken by the courtroom doors opening. A tall woman in an army dress uniform entered her insignia, identifying her as a colonel. She surveyed the scene before her. Noting the standing crowd and David in his wheelchair, Colonel Jennifer Ramirez, U.S. Army Judge Advocate General's Corps, she announced approaching the bench. "Your Honor, I've been sent by the Department of Veterans Affairs to observe these proceedings following multiple complaints about treatment of disabled veterans in this jurisdiction." Judge Brooks's face padded slightly. "Colonel, this is an active proceeding. You have no standing to." On the contrary, Colonel Ramirez interrupted smoothly, placing a document before the judge. "This federal order grants me observer status in any proceeding involving veterans with service-connected disabilities. And what I've observed in just these few moments is deeply troubling." The tension in courtroom 7 had reached a breaking point. Judge Brooks stared at the federal order before her, then at Colonel Ramirez, whose presence seemed to fill the room. Despite her calm demeanor, the spectators remained standing, a silent jury passing judgment on the proceedings. "This court is in recess for 15 minutes. Judge Brooks finally declared, banging her gavel with less force than usual. "Colonel Ramirez, my chambers now." As the judge swept from the bench, David remained in his wheelchair surrounded by Marcus and several concerned citizens who had come forward to check on him. The elderly Korean War veteran approached, extending a gnarled hand. "Staff Sergeant Frank Morales, 38th Infantry Regiment." He introduced himself. "What happened here today isn't right, son." David shook the offered hand. "Thank you for standing, sir. It means more than you know. We take care of our own," Frank replied simply. While David received quiet support from the gathered crowd, a very different scene unfolded in Judge Brooks's chambers. Though the heavy oak door muffled their voices, courthouse veterans would later report that they had never heard the judge raise her voice as she did that day. "This is judicial interference." Judge Brooks could be heard exclaiming, "You cannot waltz into my courtroom and undermine my authority." Colonel Ramirez's response was too quiet to hear, but whatever she said caused a lengthy silence, followed by the sound of papers being shuffled. Inside the chambers, Judge Brooks sank into her chair, staring at the photographs Colonel Ramirez had placed before her. They showed David Keene in Iraq, standing tall beside his unit, then later in a military hospital. His body broken, but his eyes still determined. The final photo showed him receiving the Purple Heart from a general seated in the same wheelchair he used today. He dragged 2 men from a burning Humvee after the IED that took his leg. Colonel Ramirez explained quietly, "The nerve damage is extensive and permanent. Some days he can use his prosthetic for short periods. Other days the pain is too severe." Judge Brooks picked up one of the photos, her fingers trembling slightly. "My father was career military," she said almost to herself. "He never tolerated excuses. Weakness of any kind was," she trailed off with, "respect, Your Honor." Colonel Ramirez said, "There's a difference between weakness and disability. What happened in your courtroom today wasn't a show of disrespect. It was a man with a profound physical limitation being forced into an impossible situation." Judge Brooks set the photo down carefully. "The law must apply equally to everyone." "Yes," Colonel Ramirez agreed. "But equal application doesn't mean identical treatment. It means ensuring everyone has equal access to justice, which sometimes requires accommodation." The judge was silent for a long moment. "I need to review these documents," she finally said. "We'll reconvene in 5 minutes." When court resumed, the atmosphere had shifted palpably. Judge Brooks returned to the bench, her usual brisk efficiency replaced by a more measured demeanor. The spectators, who had remained standing during the recess, watched her expectantly. "Please be seated," she instructed the gallery waiting as they complied. Her gaze fell on David, who met her eyes steadily from his wheelchair. "Sergeant Keene," she began, then paused, seeming to reconsider her words. "Mr. Keene, this court owes you an apology." A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. In my zeal to uphold the dignity of these proceedings, I failed to recognize that dignity works both ways. The court must show the same respect it demands. She straightened a stack of papers before her, a nervous gesture at odds with her usual confidence. The charges of contempt are dismissed. Furthermore, I am issuing an administrative order that all future proceedings involving you will accommodate your disability, including the option for video appearances when appropriate. David nodded, his expression solemn. Thank you, Your Honor. Judge Brooks wasn't finished. Additionally, I am ordering a full review of this courthouse's accessibility compliance to be completed within 30 days. She looked up, addressing the entire courtroom now, and I will be personally reviewing our procedures for accommodating disabilities to ensure that what happened here today is never repeated. As she prepared to adjourn, David raised his hand slightly. Your Honor, if I may. After a moment's hesitation, Judge Brooks nodded. I don't want special treatment, David said clearly. I never have what I want. What all veterans want is the chance to participate fully in the society we fought to defend. Sometimes that requires understanding, not exemption. Judge Brooks held his gaze for a long moment. The court recognizes your point, Mr. Keene. She lifted her gavel, then paused, and the court, I thank you for your service. The gavel fell gently, and courtroom 7 was dismissed. The events in Judge Brooks's courtroom might have ended there. A private moment of reckoning, a wrong addressed justice served in its quiet way. But as David wheeled himself from the courthouse that afternoon, he found a small crowd of reporters waiting on the steps. Sergeant Keene, can you comment on what happened in court today? David hesitated, unaccustomed to such attention. Marcus, standing protectively beside him, began to deflect the questions. But David placed a hand on his arm. It's okay, he said quietly, then turned to face the reporters. What happened today wasn't about me. It was about recognizing that true justice must be accessible to everyone, regardless of their physical limitations. His simple, dignified response resonated far beyond that small county courthouse. By evening, local news stations were running the story. By the next morning, national outlets had picked it up, framing it as a powerful moment of reckoning about how America treats its veterans and people with disabilities. In the days that followed, David received hundreds of letters and emails from veterans across the country sharing similar experiences. Disability rights advocates reached out asking him to speak at events. A prominent law firm offered to represent him pro bono in filing a class action lawsuit to address systemic accessibility issues in courthouses nationwide. David was overwhelmed by the attention. I'm just a high school physics teacher who served his country. He told Marcus over coffee a week after the hearing. I never wanted to be the face of anything. Sometimes we don't choose our battles, Marcus replied. Sometimes they choose us. After careful consideration, David declined the lawsuit offer, but agreed to testify before a Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs. As the hearing date approached, he spent hours preparing his testimony with the help of Colonel Ramirez, who had remained in contact since that day in court. Don't make it about legal technicalities, she advised during their final preparation session. Make it about human dignity. That's something everyone can understand. The night before the hearing, David received an unexpected visitor at his modest apartment. Judge Elena Brooks stood awkwardly at his door, no longer imposing in her judicial robes, but dressed in civilian clothes that somehow made her seem smaller, more human. May I come in? She asked, her usual authoritative tone replaced by something more tentative. David wheeled back to allow her entry, surprise evident on his face. This is unexpected, Your Honor, Elena, please, she said, taking the seat he offered. I'm not here in my official capacity. A moment of uncomfortable silence stretched between them before she continued. I've been following the attention your case has received. I understand you're testifying before the Senate tomorrow. David nodded. I am Judge Brooks. Elena twisted her hands in her lap. I wanted to tell you something I've never told anyone. She took a deep breath. My father was career military, as you know. What people don't know is that he came home from Vietnam with PTSD, though it wasn't called that then. David remained silent. Sensing she needed to continue uninterrupted, he refused to acknowledge his condition, refused any help. He believed that admitting weakness was unforgivable. Her voice caught slightly. He drank himself to death when I was in law school. I found him. I'm sorry, David said quietly. Elena nodded. I've spent my career trying to be what he wanted. Strong, unyielding, never showing what he would have called weakness. When I saw you in that wheelchair," she paused. "I think I was seeing what my father feared becoming, and I reacted badly." "We all carry things that aren't visible," David observed. "Yes," she agreed. "What I'm trying to say is I was wrong. Not just legally or procedurally wrong, morally wrong. And I want you to know that what happened in my courtroom changed me." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "These are the new accessibility guidelines I've implemented in my courtroom. The full courthouse review will take time, but I wanted you to see that your moment, is creating real change." David accepted the folder, touched by the gesture. "Thank you for telling me about your father." As she prepared to leave, Elena turned back. "What will you tell them tomorrow?" The Senate committee. David considered for a moment that true strength isn't about standing on your own, it's about standing together. The next morning, David found himself in the imposing Senate hearing room facing a semicircle of politicians whose expressions ranged from genuine concern to barely concealed impatience. The room was packed with veterans, disability advocates, and media. In the back row, David spotted Elena Brooks sitting quietly beside Colonel Ramirez. Senator James Morrison, the committee chair, called the hearing to order. "Sergeant Keene, we've allotted you 5 minutes for your opening statement." David positioned his wheelchair before the microphone. The prepared statement lay before him, but as he looked out at the assembled faces, he set it aside. "Senators, I had a carefully written statement about accessibility laws and compliance issues. It's important stuff, but that's not why I'm really here." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I'm here because 2 weeks ago I couldn't stand in a courtroom when ordered to, and something remarkable happened." David described the scene, his fall, the spontaneous uprising of support, the transformation of a moment of humiliation into one of solidarity. "I've spent 4 years learning to live with limitations I never imagined I'd have." He continued, "Some days I can stand for a few minutes, some days I can't. But every day I have to navigate a world that wasn't built for people like me." He gestured to his wheelchair. "This isn't just how I get around. It's a daily reminder that our society often confuses accommodation with special treatment. It's not special treatment to need a ramp instead of stairs. It's not special treatment to need a courtroom that doesn't require you to perform physical feats beyond your capability." The room had fallen completely silent, every eye fixed on the veteran. "When I was in Iraq, I never questioned why I was there. I still believe in serving something larger than myself. All I'm asking is that when we come home broken, the country we serve doesn't break us further through indifference or bureaucracy." David looked directly at the committee members. "Gentlemen, ladies, I'm not here asking for pity, I'm asking for the same thing. I fought for dignity. The dignity to participate fully in society, to access justice, to be seen as a whole person despite my disabilities." He paused, then delivered his final thought. "In that courtroom when I couldn't stand, others stood for me. That's what America should be, a place where we stand for each other when we cannot stand alone." As David finished speaking, Senator Morrison leaned forward. "Sergeant Keene the first." But before he could continue, something unprecedented happened. Senator Morrison stood. Beside him, Senator Watkins stood as well. One by one, every member of the committee rose to their feet. Throughout the hearing room, people began to stand. Veterans, staffers, reporters, spectators. In the back row, Elena Brooks stood with tears streaming down her face. For the second time in 2 weeks, a room full of people stood for a man who could not stand for himself. But this time, it wasn't a protest, it was a promise. The image became iconic. A disabled veteran in his wheelchair facing a room of standing senators and citizens. Every major newspaper carried it, social media amplified it. The moment transcended political divisions, speaking to something more fundamental about respect and dignity.